Hello, I'm Dr. Kevin Kellaway, and in this video, I'd like to talk about what we know about effective leadership in organizations. And of course, as a good academic, I have to start by defining my terms. So people who do research on leadership typically look at leadership in one of two ways. They either look at leadership as someone who has a formal position of authority. You're a manager, you're a supervisor, you're a director. And then the question of interest is, how did you get in that role and how effective are you in that role? And then there's another group of leadership researchers who look at leadership as a process of social influence. So you might say, you might hear the saying, everyone can be a leader. And this is what they're talking about, is that everyone can influence other people in some way. And in that sense, everyone can be a leader. Not everybody can be the director of the firm or the manager or whatever, but everyone can be a leader in the sense of influencing others. And those are sort of two camps in the leadership literature, but really, for most people who study organizations, what we're interested in is sort of the combination of those two things. We're interested in how do those in authority, how do those who have leadership roles, they're supervisors, managers, directors, how do they influence others? How do they treat other people? How do they get other people to go along with their ideas? And that's been a question now for well over 100 years of research that we're going to quickly skim through to get to the good stuff at the end. But first, I think it's useful to think about how well we're doing that. And if we say, well, how do people in authority influence other people? It makes sense to say, well, how do other people respond to people in authority? How do we view our managers and our supervisors? And this is an interesting set of data. I think it came out of one of I think it's Gilbert's book on happiness. And the pitch for this particular study, it's based on 1,500 people. And the pitch for this particular study was that as humans, we don't like to be alone. We're social creatures and we'd like to be with other people. So they simply asked people to rate how happy they were on a scale from 1 to 5 when they were with various types of people. And obviously we have the average number of hours each day we spent with those people. So hands down, we're happiest with our friends. This makes sense. We choose to be with our friends, so that's where we're happiest. A little lower down, but still in that range, is our relatives, spouse, and children. We're a little less happy because maybe you didn't choose your relatives. Maybe you did for a spouse, but people grow, times change. But we're still, moderately happy there. When we get to work, we're a little less happy again with clients and coworkers, but still sort of at the middle of the scale. When we're alone, it's about 2.7 out of 5. And then to the surprise of the researchers, the all-time worst thing was when people said they spent time with their boss. That's when they were least happy. I think that's a troublesome finding for people who hold formal leadership roles in organizations, that we are the people that our employees, the people who report to us, are least likely to want to spend time with. And if that was just one finding, I think that would be bad and we should be concerned about it. But I think there are other research findings that also suggest that maybe we're not having the positive effect that we think we are. And one of my favorite studies, I call it the British Nurses Studies, but it's a study by Wagar, Hussey, and Feldman, published in a medical journal. And they identified a group of nurses who worked 12-hour shifts in the hospital. But their supervisors only worked 8-hour shifts. So 2/3 of the way through your shift, you would change supervisors, or the supervisor would change. And to a researcher, we call it a naturally occurring field experiment. So it wasn't designed that way, it was just the schedule, but it gives us the opportunity to look at what happens when you switch from one supervisor to another. And in this case, the nurses had 2 supervisors, one of whom they thought was was overbearing and sort of controlling and not a very pleasant person to be around. And the other who wasn't, they didn't say was a great leader or anything. They just said she was a fair supervisor. You know, you could count on her, and she was a fair, reasonable person. So they had these nurses wear ambulatory blood pressure monitors. So that's a little machine, blood pressure cuff wired to a hard drive that you wear on a belt, and you can program it. In this case, they programmed it to take your blood pressure every hour. And what they're interested in is what happens when you go from the overbearing supervisor to the fair supervisor, or from the fair to the overbearing. Does that change your blood pressure in any way? And what they found when you went from the fair to the overbearing supervisor, your systolic blood pressure increased by 15 millimeters. So, you know, we always say blood pressure should be 120/80. That's systolic over diastolic. So systolic's the top number, and it went up by 15 millimeters, and the diastolic went up by 7. And you say, well, is that a big change? Is it a little change? What does that mean? They actually address this in their discussion. They say, if you look at the epidemiological research on blood pressure, it means your risk of a heart attack went up by 16% when you went from a fair to an overbearing supervisor. And your risk of a stroke went up by 38%. Now, we don't often think as leaders that we're having that kind of impact on other people's health, but in fact we are. And there's been subsequent research. One of my students, Jennifer Wong, and I did a study very much like this, found exactly the same thing, that when you had negative interactions with your supervisor, your blood pressure went way up. And if that happened enough in the day, your blood pressure stayed up even when you were off work and home at night. There's other studies in the British civil service suggesting that whether your supervisor treats you fairly or not has a long-term impact on your cardiovascular health. So this is not an isolated finding. It suggests that leaders are having a real impact on other people and their well-being. And that leads us to the question then, so how do we do this right? How do we become effective as a leader? So I'd ask you to think about that. And one way to think about it is, think about the best leader you ever had, or the best leader you ever knew. So that could be a former boss or a current boss. It could be a teacher, it could be a coach, just someone in your life that you really think of it as a leader, an effective leader. And then you think about, what is it that that leader did that makes you think they're so great? Right? So not necessarily how they made me feel, but what is it they actually did in terms of their behavior that makes you think they're a great leader? In the last 20 years or so, I bet you I've asked that question 1,000 times. We ask it all the time in training sessions and executive sessions and in our courses on leadership. And so I know that two things. A, we get remarkably similar answers from every group we ask this question to, and it really doesn't matter who the group is. So senior military officials give the same answers as high school kids, as union shop stewards, as mid-level executives. Doesn't matter so much the level of leadership. And people are remarkably consistent in what they tell us good leadership is. And it might be things like this. So you might say, you know, they were a role model. They set high standards, you know. The phrase we often hear in training is, they walked the talk, right? They did what they said they were going to do. We often hear about leaders who are enthusiastic, who are inspiring and motivational, right? Who elevate everybody through their actions. We hear about leaders who challenge you, who make you think about things and not just accept, you know, sort of common wisdom, but actually think problems through. And we hear a lot about leaders who pay attention to you as an individual, who really listen to you and coach you and advise you. And those all seem to be elements of really effective leadership. And we'll come back to those. But first, I'll drag you through 100 years of research. So very quickly, we've been studying leadership in organizations for well over 100 years now. And at the very beginning, so think 1800s, people doing a liberal arts education, and the way they learned about leadership is you would read the biographies of the so-called great men, right? And the little SIC there means I know that's an error. But it really was at the time, the focus was on great men and it excluded women. That's an ironic exclusion, as it turns out, because we find out later that women are in fact very effective leaders. But at the time, in school, you would, take Latin and you'd read about Julius Caesar, and you'd take Greek and read about Alexander the Great. And the theory was if we read the biographies of these great leaders, we would learn what it is to be a great leader ourselves. And that still exists. We have, people who've had success in business, Jack Welch or somebody, and they often publish an autobiography, which people then read to find out their leadership secrets, sort of thing. But it doesn't take us very far, and it's often very contradictory, and it's hard to figure out what to extract from those biographies, because leaders, like everybody else, have their good points and their bad points. So around the turn of the 20th century, early first part of that, up until World War II, people really focused on trying to extract the traits of good leaders. So are good leaders, are leaders more intelligent than their direct reports? Do they have a different personality? Are they more extroverted, or are they more conscientious? And there are certainly data to support a lot of those things. There's some evidence that leaders are more intelligent than the people they lead, but only a bit. You can't be too much smarter. So it's a limited sort of relationship. But there are other traits, that sort of enduring traits. We know that leaders tend to be extroverted, although certainly there are introverted leaders. And this is one of the problems. Every time you find a general pattern, you can find the exception to it. Leaders tend to be taller than average, although there's certainly examples of many, shorter leaders as well. So trait theory is not very useful in the sense that there's some evidence for them, but they can be very contradictory. And I think the really big breakthrough came post-World War II at Ohio State University. These are known as the Ohio State Studies, where they tried to identify the behaviors of effective leaders. So let's forget about their personal characteristics and traits. What is it that they actually do? And that literature tend to focus on two sets of behaviors. One they called initiating structure, or task behaviors, task-focused behaviors. And that was the leader's ability to manage the workplace, right? To make sure you have the supplies, to do the scheduling, to arrange the workplace so that the work got done efficiently. And then the other set of behaviors were called consideration, or people-oriented behavior. And that was really focusing on employees as individuals, listening to them, trying to keep them satisfied at work, and things like that. And of course, the ideal there would be we would have both of those. We would be, very task-oriented and have a high level of consideration as well. And over time, we found that doesn't often happen. So people tend to be better at one than the other. And it's very rare that people are really good at both of those things. But still, again, for all of these as we go along, there's some evidence for each of these theories. And then post 1960s, so the next 20 years or so, up until the 1980s, people focused on contingency theories, because they said, well, wait, okay, so we know there's initiating structure and consideration, there's task behaviors, people behaviors, but what if the situation changes? What if we're in an emergency, right? If anyone who's taken first aid will know that what they teach you to do is, if you come upon someone, say, who's unconscious or has been in an accident, and you're the first aider, you become very directive, right? you don't ask people who would like to call an ambulance or whatever. You would identify somebody and say, you go call an ambulance now, right? So you become very task focused, even though that's not, may not be your personal style. And that's the idea of contingency theories. This is in an emergency situation, maybe we should be more task focused, less people focused. If you have, for example, a team of employees who've all worked for the organization for years and they all know what they're doing, maybe you need to focus more on consideration, less on task, because they know how to organize the work, right? So in interesting perspective, it keeps coming back. I think people are unwilling to let it go. But one of the things we found is around that too, is over the long term, we're very bad at switching. So we tend to have a preferred style. And although we can switch, we're not that good at it. And we often don't switch when maybe we should, right? So contingency theories or situational leadership theories have some truth to them, hard to put into practice. And in fact, one of the old saying was, if you can't change the leader, then you need to change the leader. And what they meant by that is if the leader can't change styles, then you need to get a new leader. But obviously that's impractical. You can't get a new leader every time there's a minor change in the situation. So we move on from that, and we're now into the modern era from the 1980s, 1990s is when it started, but really it goes on today. The two most popular theories are LMX, which is leader member exchange theory, which really talks about the relationship between leaders and their members with their employees, and transformational leadership theory. So for the rest of this brief video, I'm going to talk mainly about transformational leadership theory. For a couple of reasons. First, there's more research on this one theory than every other theory combined. So all of those other theories, from great men up to situational theories and LMX, there's still more research on transformational leadership theory. It's been extensively validated. That is, we know the propositions of the theory work. And we know that through lab studies, we know that through field studies in real organizations with real employees and real leaders. There's also, I think it's very important, there's good evidence that we can teach transformational leadership. And when we teach people to engage in transformational leadership behaviors, their employees will see the change in the behavior and experience changes themselves, that they'll become more motivated, more committed to the organization, etc., happier, all those things that we want our employees to be. So in that sense, it's important that transformational leadership works, but it's just as important that we can teach people to do it. So it really begins, transformational leadership talks about sort of 7 different leadership styles, 3 of which are called transactional leadership. I always call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the bad form of leadership is generally known as laissez-faire leadership, and people are now talking about passive leadership. It's the same basic notion. Laissez-faire, of course, French for leave alone, and that's the absent leader. It's the leader who's never there, won't make decisions, won't respond to you, all those things. A very bad form of leadership. It's actually sort of an oxymoron, right? It's not leadership. It feels strange to talk about leaders who aren't leaders, but that's what laissez-faire leadership is all about. The ugly form of transactional leadership is called management by exception, and that's really the idea that I'm going to monitor your performance, and I'm not going to engage with you in any way. I'm just going to monitor you. And then when something goes wrong, I'm going to jump all over you. Right. So it's a very negative sort of coercive style of leadership. And that's why I call it the ugly. And I'm not going to spend too much time on those two because we don't want to talk about how to do the bad things. We'd rather get away from those. But both of these styles of leadership are overwhelmingly negative for people. But there is also a good form of transactions. Now, by transaction, I mean It's based on the notion that the employee does something and then the leader does something in exchange. And that's the transaction, right? And those other things are, those other two styles are bad transactions. Um, the management by exception, we wait for you to do something wrong and then we yell at you. It's a negative transaction. Or in laissez-faire, no matter what you do, we don't respond to it, and that's a bad transaction. But there are good transactions, generally called contingent reward. If you know the book, The 1 Minute Manager, it's very similar to that idea. So that these are this is basic good management, right? It's you set goals, you provide immediate unbiased feedback, right? And you exchange recognition and rewards for good performance, right? So an employee does something the way you want them to, or does something really well, you make a point of telling them right away, hey, I saw the way you dealt with that customer. That was great, right? And if they did something wrong, you tell them right away, hey, I saw the way that, that transaction went, and maybe there's a better way we can handle it. Why don't you try this, right? So it's that immediate feedback that's going to make the difference in performance, right? Lots of data on the value of recognition. In the 1 Minute Manager, Blanchard and Johnson said the key to developing people is to catch them doing something right. Right. And what they meant by that is we should be giving more and more positive feedback. We shouldn't ignore negative, right? If someone does something wrong, we should definitely tell them about it. But most people are doing the right things all the time. So we need a point of generating that positive recognition, positive feedback. And one of the implications of that is probably we have to be where the employees are, right? That we can't be in our office because they're not going to run in and say, look what I can do. If you want to see how they work, you have to be at the workplace. You have to be sort of watching them and attentive. So those are all forms of transaction, and especially contingent reward, as I said, is basic good management. It's how you get to people to perform the way you want them to perform. And transformational leadership goes sort of beyond that. And in fact, one of the first books on transformational leadership was called Leadership and Performance Beyond Expectations. So how do you get people to do more than they thought they could do? How do you get them to do more than even you thought they could do? And the originator of the theory, a guy named Bernie Bass, spent time thinking about what really effective leadership would look like. And he basically suggested 4 things that he thinks would be very effective leadership, and all the data subsequent to that support this. So he says, first of all, we talked about leaders as role models. He called that idealized influence. And he said, leaders, your first role as leader is you have to do the right things yourself because people watch you. I always tell people, if you're a leader, imagine you're on a darkened stage with a bright spotlight on you because your employees are watching everything you do. Right. So it's important then that you're doing the right things and you're saying the right things and you're living up to what you say. And all of that is idealized influence. He talked about inspirational motivation, and that's raising people's expectations. And that's the being inspiring, being motivational, really sort of raising the level in the workplace. One of the simplest example is how important it is for a leader to be positive, right? It's really easy in organizations to be very negative and cynical. And I think part of the leader's role is to be positive and to raise people's spirits so that they're not always focused on the things that are going wrong. We can put those two together, and idealized and influence and inspirational motivation. We can do those two together. That's typically what we call charisma. We talk about, charismatic leaders that employees want to be like or feel attracted to. They want to be around you. They want to act like you. And it's the combination of those two things, idealized influence and inspirational motivation, that results in that sense of charisma. We also talk about intellectual stimulation. And intellectual stimulation, I think best defined as think about old problems in new ways, right? Is how do we we all have in every organization, we have problems that have gone on for a long time. And then how do we address those problems? And it's to come up with new solutions. The story somebody told me once about ergonomists and kinesiologists all met at a conference, and they were talking about lower back pain at work, and the challenge they were given at the end of the conference was to come up with some simple recommendations for organizations on how to deal with lower back injuries, which are, you know, an endemic problem in many industries, and then they, you know, vastly expensive in terms of workers' compensation and benefits and things like that. And one of their answers that I think sort of surprised people was simply stop putting things on the floor. And that sounds like almost a silly response. But if you think it through, when we put stock or whatever on the floor, it means we have to bend down to put it there, and we have to bend down to pick it up again. And when are you going to injure your back? When you're bending and lifting at the same time. So we've spent, you know, decades trying to teach people lift with your legs, not with your back. And we've had back supports. We've got all these kind of things to fix it. And maybe the simpler solution is just redesign the workplace so that stock is never put on the floor and you're never bending to pick it. Right? That's an innovative solution to an old problem that's been around for a long time. And then we talk about individualized consideration, which is really, I always say, treating people as people, right? So individualized consideration is about listening to people and paying attention to them, knowing them as people, not just as employees, and then spending time with them, teaching, coaching, mentoring, all those sorts of things. And for most of these things, you know, in training, we focus on some very simple behaviors that can lead to these four conditions. You know, if we want to increase our intellectual stimulation, one of the things I always suggest to people is that you ask questions at least 5 times a day. You ask, what do you think we should do? Or when somebody asks you, what should we do about this? What do you think we should do? Right? So it's turning it back and asking people to think about the problems. Individualized consideration is largely about spending time with people. So if you're locked in your office all day and you never see your employees, obviously you're not doing well at this. And you need to get out of your office, you know, maybe walk around the workplace, not to monitor people, but maybe even just to chat every now and then, or say hi, or ask how things are going, things like that. Inspirational motivation. Again, we can sort of increase that by setting very specific goals to praise people, or, you know, to say, I know you can do this, or what a great job you did on this. To do that, you know, 4 or 5 times a day is a very powerful thing for a leader to do. Hard to talk about how to raise idealized influence. That's the harder one for me to come up with behavioral examples. But certainly the more you can talk as a leader about what's important to you, and then, you know, you have to make sure you're living that out. But it's certainly a good idea to talk about your values and what you think is important, because that's how employees know what to expect from you. So there's these four things that comprise transformational leadership. There's very specific behaviors that can lead us to, or lead them to think that we're demonstrating these behaviors, and that's what effective leadership is all about. Is they have to see you engage in those effective behaviors. So then our question remains, how do we put these to work, especially in the context of chronic pain? And that's the focus of our third video, where we're going to try to put together the information we now have about transformational leadership with what we know about chronic pain to come up with an effective leadership response. See you then.